The candles were already burning too fast when Margaret Ashby heard the carriage wheels stop outside the gate. She had exactly 1 hour. 1 hour to become someone she was not. Lady Cordelia Whitmore lay against a mountain of pillows, her face the color of old paper, one hand pressed to her chest as if she could hold her own heart still by force. The physician had already come and gone, muttering about fever and rest and absolutely no travel tonight. Cordelia had waited until the door closed behind him before she grabbed Margaret's wrist with a grip that did not belong to a sick woman. "You will go in my place," she said, "tonight, to the Duke's Masquerade." Margaret laughed. It was the wrong kind of laugh, the kind that comes out before the brain has caught up with the ears. "My lady," she said, "I manage your linens. I do not attend balls." "Tonight you do," Cordelia said. "If Ravensmoor's household believes this family has snubbed him, my brother loses the contract that is keeping this estate from ruin. You know the numbers. You keep the numbers. You are the only person in this house who understands exactly what we lose if no one from this family walks through those doors tonight." Margaret understood the numbers. That was the trouble with being trusted with everything. There was no version of the argument she could win. An hour later she stood in front of the tall mirror in Cordelia's dressing room, wearing Cordelia's second-best gown, because the best one would not close over shoulders that had spent 9 years hauling coal buckets and ledgers instead of reclining on chaises. The gown was the deep blue of a bruise just starting to heal. A mask of white feathers and silver wire waited on the table, shaped like something that might fly away if she blinked. She did not recognize the woman in the glass. That was the point. 9 years since her husband died in a shipping accident that the company called unfortunate and paid for with a single month's wages. 9 years of becoming so useful, so competent, so invisible that people forgot to see her as a woman at all. She had become furniture with opinions, a ledger with a pulse. Tonight the ledger was wearing silk. Her maid, a sharp-eyed girl named Alice who knew every secret in the house and kept most of them, fastened the last hook at the back of the gown and stepped away to look. "You look like her," Alice said. "From behind, anyway. God help you if anyone gets close enough to see your hands." Margaret glanced down at her own hands, rough at the knuckles, a small burn scar across 2 fingers from the kitchen fire 3 winters ago. Cordelia's hands had never touched anything hotter than a teacup. "Gloves," she said. "Already packed," Alice said, and held up long silver gloves that would cover everything that might give her away. The carriage ride to Ravensmoor Hall took 40 minutes. Margaret spent every one of them rehearsing a woman she had never been. Cordelia's slow blink when she disagreed with something, Cordelia's habit of touching her own collarbone when she lied, Cordelia's laugh, which came from the throat and never the stomach. By the time the carriage stopped, Margaret had convinced herself she could do this. She had not accounted for the Duke. Ravensmoor Hall glowed like something on fire that had decided fire could be beautiful. Windows blazed gold. Music spilled out into the courtyard before the doors had even opened, 100 violins arguing sweetly with each other. Servants in Ravensmoor livery took names at the entrance, checked them against a list, and Margaret gave Cordelia's name in Cordelia's voice and felt her own heart try to climb up through her throat. The servant nodded her through without a second look. That was almost disappointing. Inside, the ballroom was a forest of masks, birds and foxes and things with no name at all, silver and gold and black, moving in slow circles under chandeliers, heavy enough to kill a man if the chains ever failed. Margaret took a glass of something pale and bubbling from a passing tray, because it gave her hands something to do, and stood at the edge of the room the way she had stood at the edge of every room for 9 years. Watching, not watched. She was 3 sips into the glass when she noticed a man across the room was not dancing. He stood near the far windows, tall in a way that made the men around him look like they were still growing into their own coats, wearing a black mask shaped like something between a wolf and a crow. Every few minutes someone approached him, bowed, spoke, and was dismissed with a nod so small it was almost an insult. He did not look bored. He looked like a man waiting for something specific to happen and refusing to pretend otherwise. Margaret looked away first. She always looked away first. It was a skill, invisibility. You had to want it more than the other person wanted to be seen. When she looked back, he was walking toward her. Not toward the room. Not toward the punch table, or the string quartet, or any of the dozen women in better gowns standing closer to the center of the floor where the light was kindest. Toward her, specifically, the way a compass needle moves toward north without needing a reason. She had nowhere to put her eyes that did not end up back on his mask. "Good evening," he said, and his voice was lower than she expected, unhurried, a voice that had never once needed to raise itself to be obeyed. "You are the only person in this room not trying to be looked at." Margaret's mind went through Cordelia's mannerisms like flipping through cards in the dark. She settled on the slow blink. "Perhaps I am simply better at hiding it," she said. Something shifted behind his mask, not quite a smile. The beginning of interest, the way a fire looks in the second before it catches. "I doubt that," he said. "I have watched this room for 2 hours. Everyone in it wants something from someone else. You are the first person tonight who looked like they wanted to be somewhere else entirely." He was not wrong. She did want to be somewhere else. She wanted to be home, in the small room off the kitchen, doing the accounts by candlelight, where nobody's eyes could land on her, and find something worth staying for. "I am Ashcombe," he said, offering the smallest bow a duke could give and still have it count as one. "Though I imagine, behind that mask, you already knew that." She had known, the way everyone in 3 counties knew the Duke of Ravensmoor's name, his fortune, and the fact that he had turned down 11 marriage proposals in 4 years without giving anyone a reason he considered their business. "And you," he said, "who are you tonight?" For 1 full second, Margaret Ashby almost told him the truth. Then she remembered the estate, the debt, Cordelia's hand gripping her wrist like a woman drowning. "Whitmore," she said, "Lady Cordelia Whitmore." The lie came out smoother than she expected, and she hated how easy it was, and she hated more how much she wanted to keep talking to him anyway. "Lady Whitmore," he repeated, "testing the name the way you test ice before you put your full weight on it. I've heard the name. I don't believe I've had the pleasure of the woman before tonight." "You have it now," she said, and was startled by her own boldness. That had not been Cordelia's line. That had been hers. He tilted his head, and something in the movement told her he had noticed. Filed it away. Not suspicion, not yet, more the way a man notices an unfamiliar bird has landed in his garden and decides to watch a little longer before naming it. An orchestra somewhere behind them began a new piece, slower, the kind that asked couples to move closer together rather than spin apart. Around the room, gloved hands reached for gloved hands. "Lady Whitmore," he said, "would you do me the discourtesy of refusing every other man in this room for the length of one dance?" Margaret looked at his offered hand, at the years of coal dust and ledger ink under her own gloves, at the mask that had become, in the last 10 minutes, the only thing standing between her whole life and his. She took his hand. "For the length of one song," she told herself. "That is all. One song, and then I disappear back into the crowd, and none of this happened, and tomorrow I go back to being furniture with opinions." His hand closed around hers, warm through the silver silk, and somewhere in her chest, something that had been folded shut for 9 years creaked open half an inch, uninvited, unwanted, impossible to close again. They danced. He was better at it than she expected from a man who spent 2 hours standing perfectly still by a window. He led without pushing, the way people do when they have never once in their life needed to force anyone to follow them. Margaret found her body remembering steps she had not used since her husband was alive, since the last time a man's hand had held hers like it meant something rather than like it was a duty owed to a chaperone. "You dance like someone who has done this before," he said. "Not recently, but before. It has been some years," she admitted, and immediately regretted the honesty of it. Cordelia had danced at every ball this season. Cordelia would not have said years. He noticed that too. She could tell by the small line that appeared between his eyebrows, there and gone in a blink, like a fish surfacing once and diving back under before you could be sure you'd seen it. The song ended. Neither of them stepped back. Another one began. Margaret knew she should leave. Knew that every additional minute in this man's company was another minute for the lie to grow legs and walk away from her, another minute for someone in this glittering room to look twice and recognize the housekeeper wearing her mistress's second-best gown. She did not leave. She told herself it was for the estate, for Cordelia, for the debt that would swallow the Whitmore name whole if the alliance with Ravensmoor was seen to fail tonight. That was not the whole truth, and some small honest part of her, buried under 9 years of other people's linens, knew it. The whole truth was that nobody had looked at her like this in a very long time. Like she was the only interesting thing in a room full of chandeliers. Across the ballroom, near the punch table, a woman in green watched the Duke dance a second song with a guest he had never once looked at during the first hour of the evening, and she was not the only one who noticed. Margaret did not see the woman watching. She was too busy trying not to look like a woman who had forgotten, for the length of 2 entire songs, exactly who she was pretending to be. The third dance was the mistake. Margaret knew it the moment the music started again, and she did not step back, did not curtsy her thanks and melt into the crowd the way any sensible woman playing a dangerous game would have done. She stayed. Her hand was still inside his. The orchestra had barely finished breathing before it started again, and somewhere in the space between songs, nobody had let go. "You are meant to dance with other men tonight," Ashcombe said, not quite a question. "Lady Whitmore does not dance 3 songs running with one partner. It draws attention." "Then perhaps Lady Whitmore has decided she does not mind the attention tonight," Margaret said. It was reckless. It was also true, and that was the frightening part. She had spent 9 years arranging her whole life around not being noticed, around making herself so useful that nobody thought to ask what she wanted, and here was a man built entirely out of noticing things, and instead of running from it, she was leaning into the light. He studied her from behind his crow-wolf mask, and for a moment she thought he had caught something, some seam in the story that did not match the fabric around it. "You surprise me," he said instead. "Every woman in this room has spent the evening trying to be predictable, trying to be exactly what a duke is supposed to want. You are the first one tonight who seems to have forgotten I am supposed to be impressed. I have never been very good at performing for an audience," she said, and this time it was not a line borrowed from Cordelia's careful catalogue of charming untruths. It was the plain truth of her own life, said out loud in a stranger's arms, and it landed harder than she expected. He did not answer right away. The silence stretched, comfortable, in a way silences with strangers rarely are. Then, from the edge of the floor, a voice cut through the music. "Cordelia, is that you, darling? I did not know you had recovered enough to attend after all." Margaret's whole body went cold. The voice belonged to a woman in deep green, with a fox mask pushed up onto her forehead, clearly someone who knew Lady Cordelia Whitmore well enough to recognize her from across a crowded floor, gown or no gown, mask or no mask. Margaret's mind raced through every possible name this could belong to. A cousin, a childhood friend, someone who had spent afternoons in Cordelia's actual company, who knew her actual voice, her actual laugh, the actual shape of the woman Margaret was currently failing to become. She did the only thing she could think to do. She turned her face half away, toward Ashcombe, as though caught mid-sentence, and let her voice drop into something breathless and vague. "Forgive me," she called back without fully turning. "I have lost my voice to this dreadful cold. I dare not shout across a room." It was thin. It was desperate. It might not survive a second question. The woman in green hesitated, clearly weighing whether to cross the floor and settle the matter properly, and Margaret felt every second of that hesitation land somewhere behind her ribs like a stone dropped into still water. Then a bell rang near the terrace doors, calling guests toward the garden for the fireworks, and the woman in green was swept up in the general drift of bodies, glancing back once, twice, before the crowd folded her away entirely. Margaret exhaled. It came out shakier than she wanted it to. "You went pale," Ashcombe said quietly, "not from cold." "I dislike being shouted at across rooms," she said. "It is not becoming." That was not fear of being rude, he said. That was fear of being known. Margaret's stomach dropped somewhere near her shoes. He had not accused her of anything. He had simply named the exact truth of the moment with the same calm precision he seemed to use for everything, the way a man reads weather rather than guesses at it. You imagine a great deal from one moment of hoarseness, she said, reaching for lightness and finding it further away than usual. I imagine very little, he said. I observe quite a lot. It is a habit I have never managed to break, even when it would be kinder to. She should have laughed it off. She should have excused herself to find the retiring room and never come back. Should have found Cordelia's carriage and gone home to the small room off the kitchen where nobody's careful eyes could find the seams in her. Instead, she asked, against every ounce of sense she had left, "And what is it, exactly, that you observe about me?" It was a mistake to ask. She wanted the answer anyway. He considered it the way he seemed to consider everything, unhurried, as if the world could wait on his conclusions, and generally did. I observe a woman who dances like she has grieved something and come out the other side of it stronger rather than smaller, he said. I observe a woman who flinched just now not because she was caught in a lie about a cold, but because being recognized terrifies her more than being unmasked ever could. I observe a woman who has spent this entire evening trying to disappear into a room she was clearly told to enter, which is the strangest thing I have seen at any ball I have attended, and I have attended a great many. Margaret said nothing. There was nothing safe to say. I do not know what you are hiding, Lady Whitmore, he said, and there was no threat in it, only the quiet patience of a man used to solving things at his own pace and in his own time. But I intend to find out before the night is through. The fireworks began outside, a low boom and then a burst of gold spreading across the dark. Guests streamed past them toward the terrace, laughing, pointing upward, and for a moment Margaret and the Duke stood still in the emptying ballroom, an island in a river of moving silk. We should go and watch, he said finally, offering his arm as though the last exchange had not happened at all. It seemed, somehow, more frightening than if he had pressed the matter further. A man who chooses to wait is a man who has already decided the answer is worth waiting for. She took his arm, because refusing would have been its own confession. The terrace was cold and full of upturned faces, gold and violet light flickering across masks and bare shoulders, and Margaret stood beside a duke who had just told her, plainly, that he intended to learn exactly who she was, and found that the fear in her chest had a second passenger riding alongside it that she did not want to name. It felt, unmistakably, like hope. She hated how much she wanted to know what he would do with the truth once he had it. Between one burst of fireworks and the next, his hand found hers again on the terrace railing, not asking permission, simply present. "Tell me one true thing," he said quietly, without looking at her, his eyes still on the sky. "Just one. It need not be your name." Margaret watched gold sparks fall and fade over the dark garden, and thought of 9 years of linens and ledgers and a life built entirely around never once being asked such a question. "I have not been happy in a very long time," she said. "Until tonight, I had nearly forgotten what it felt like." His hand tightened around hers, just slightly, and he said nothing at all, and the silence between them was the loudest thing Margaret had heard all evening. Somewhere across the garden, half hidden behind a hedge of roses, the woman in the fox mask stood watching the Duke of Ravensmoor hold hands with a woman she was almost, though not entirely, certain was not who she claimed to be. She said nothing to anyone yet. But she did not look away, either. Margaret did not see her. She was too busy learning, for the first time in 9 years, what it felt like to be wanted for nothing more than the fact of being present. It would not last the night. Some part of her already knew that, but she let herself have it anyway. One more hour, one more dance, one more lie she was not ready to give up yet. The garden was quieter than the ballroom, and that quiet was its own kind of danger. Margaret had meant to slip away during the fireworks, to make some excuse about the cold air not suiting her, and find Cordelia's carriage before the fox-masked woman found her nerve again. Instead, she found herself walking beside Ashcombe along a gravel path lit by paper lanterns, the noise of the party falling away behind them like a tide going out. "You are very quiet for a woman who was, 10 minutes ago, the boldest guest in the room," he said. "I am considering my exit," she said, which was true, though not in the way he would understand it. "Already? The night is young." "The night is exactly as old as it needs to be," she said, and something in her own voice startled her. It sounded like a woman who had made peace with an ending before it arrived. She realized, with a small, cold jolt, that this was true of her whole life. She had spent 9 years making peace with endings in advance, so that when they came, they never had the chance to surprise her. Ashcombe stopped walking. When she turned back, he was watching her with an expression she could not read behind the mask, something between curiosity and concern. "You speak like a woman who has already decided how this evening ends," he said. "I find I do not care for that decision. You do not know what decision it is." "I know it involves you leaving before I have learned your name," he said. "That is decision enough for me to dislike it." Margaret's throat tightened. She thought of Cordelia at home, feverish and waiting, of the debt hanging over the estate like a blade on a fraying rope, of everything that depended on her walking away from this man tonight and never being found out. She thought, too, of 9 years without a single evening like this one. They reached a stone bench at the edge of a small pond, the water black and still, except where the last of the fireworks smoke drifted low across its surface. Ashcombe gestured for her to sit, and after a moment's hesitation, she did, and he sat beside her, close enough that his sleeve brushed hers. "Can I tell you something I have never told anyone at one of these events?" he said. "You may." "I hate them," he said. "Every single one. The dancing, the masks, the small talk about weather and horses. I have attended more balls than I could count, and until tonight I could not have told you a single thing that happened at any of them worth remembering. And tonight? Tonight I met a woman who looked like she wanted to disappear, and instead of disappearing, she looked at me like I was the first honest thing she had seen all year," he said. "I do not know your name. I am beginning to think I do not need it as badly as I thought I did an hour ago." Margaret felt something crack open in her chest, not sudden but slow, the way ice gives when the whole surface has been thinning for longer than anyone noticed. "My husband died 9 years ago," she said, before she could stop herself. "In a shipping accident. He was a good man. Not a rich one, not a titled one, but a good one, and after he died, I learned how to become useful instead of loved, because useful women do not get left behind twice." She had not meant to say any of it. It came out of her the way water comes through a crack once the crack has decided to exist. Ashcombe did not speak right away. He watched the smoke drift over the black water, and when he finally answered, his voice had lost its usual unhurried polish. "My father arranged 11 marriages for me before he died," he said. 11 women who wanted a title and a fortune and had no particular interest in the man attached to either. I turned down every one, and everyone in 3 counties believes I am simply difficult, or grieving my father too long, or waiting for someone who does not exist. Is she real, this someone? I did not think so, he said. Until tonight I was beginning to believe I had invented her, simply so I would have an excuse to keep saying no. The silence between them was not empty. It was full of everything neither of them was saying, the surface of the evening still moving pleasantly along, masks and music somewhere behind them, while underneath it something much older and much more dangerous had begun to surface, uninvited, unstoppable, the way grief and hope sometimes rise from the same well. Margaret realized her hand had found his, without either of them deciding it should. I should go home, she said. Soon. Not yet, he said. Soon, she repeated, more to herself than to him. He turned to face her fully then, and reached up, slowly enough that she could have stopped him and did not, and touched the edge of her mask, not lifting it, simply resting 2 fingers against the white feathers at her cheekbone. I will not take this from you tonight, he said. I want to. I want to know what you look like when you are not performing invisibility for a room that does not deserve your attention. But I will not take it from you before you are ready to give it." Margaret closed her eyes. Behind the mask, hidden from him, she allowed herself 1 full second of something dangerously close to tears, not from sadness, but from the strange, unbearable relief of being seen and not yet punished for it. "Why are you being kind to me?" she asked. "You do not know who I am." "I know exactly who you are," he said. "I know you dance like grief that survived itself. I know you flinch at your own name being called. I know you have spent this whole evening trying to give away as little of yourself as possible, and failing, beautifully, at every turn. I do not need a family name to know that." A servant appeared at the far end of the garden path, carrying a lantern, calling softly that the second round of dancing was about to begin inside, and the moment broke the way moments always break, gently, at the worst possible time. Ashcombe stood and offered his hand to help her up. She took it. "One more dance," he said. "And then, if you must go, I will not stop you, but give me one more." She should have said no. Every practical bone in her body, every year of managing Cordelia's accounts and anticipating disaster before it arrived, told her to say no, to walk to the carriage now, while the fox-masked woman was still distracted by punch and gossip, to preserve what remained of the lie before it collapsed entirely. She said yes. The ballroom had grown warmer, more crowded, the music louder, and this time when they danced it was different from before, less like two strangers testing the edges of a conversation, and more like two people who had already decided, somewhere in the garden, that whatever this was, it mattered. Halfway through the dance, Ashcombe's hand tightened briefly at her waist, and he leaned close enough that his voice reached only her. "I am tired," he said, "of being wanted for what I own rather than who I am. Every woman in this room tonight has looked at my title before she has looked at my face. You are the only one who looked at my face first and has not yet asked what my title is worth." Margaret's breath caught. It was true, she realized. She had not once, in 2 hours of conversation, thought about his fortune, his lands, his name. She had thought only about the particular way he tilted his head when he was listening, the low, unhurried timbre of his voice, the strange, steady warmth of a man who noticed everything and judged very little of what he found. "I know what it is to be valued for a function rather than a person," she said, before she could stop herself. "I have spent 9 years being useful to people who never once wondered what I wanted for myself." The words hung in the air between them, too honest, too specific, the kind of sentence a lady of Cordelia Whitmore's standing would never have reason to say. She saw it land on him, saw the small crease appear between his brows again, the one that meant he was turning something over, and finding it did not quite match the shape he expected. "You speak," he said slowly, "like a woman who has served rather than one who has been served." Margaret's heart slammed once, hard, against her ribs. "I speak," she said, recovering as quickly as she could, like a woman who has managed a household long enough to understand what it costs the people who run it. It was close enough to the truth to hold, and far enough from it to survive, but she saw in his eyes that the crack had widened, that some part of him now suspected the woman in his arms was not entirely who she claimed, even if he could not yet say why or how. He did not accuse her. He did not step back, or call for the fox-masked woman, or do any of the things a lesser man might have done to expose a lie mid-dance for the satisfaction of being right. He simply held her a little closer and said, very quietly, "Whoever you are, I find I would still like to know you when this is finished." The song ended. The musicians paused to retune, and in that small window of silence, a commotion rose near the front doors, servants moving quickly, voices low and urgent, and Margaret turned to see Alice, her own maid, standing white-faced just inside the entrance, scanning the crowd with the particular desperation of someone who has run the entire distance from the Whitmore estate without stopping once. Something in Margaret's chest went very cold and very still. She knew, before Alice even reached her, that whatever news she carried would end this evening long before Margaret was ready to let it end. She excused herself from Ashcombe with a curtsy too quick to be graceful, and crossed the floor toward her maid, her borrowed silk suddenly heavier than it had been all night, as if the gown itself had begun to remember it was not hers to wear. Alice caught her arm before she could speak. "My lady," she whispered, using the wrong name out of habit and terror both. "Lady Cordelia has taken a turn. The physician says she must be moved. Her carriage is already on its way here, and she has sent word ahead that she will arrive within the half-hour to collect her own place at this ball, whatever the cost." Margaret felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her silver slippers. "Half an hour," she repeated. "Perhaps less," Alice said. "My lady, if anyone sees the two of you together tonight, in the same room, wearing the same face—" She did not need to finish the sentence. Margaret already understood exactly what it would mean. Not simply exposure, not simply embarrassment. It would mean the ruin of everything Cordelia had sent her here to protect, undone in a single unbearable moment of two women standing where only one was supposed to exist. Across the ballroom, through the moving crowd of masks and candlelight, Margaret caught the Duke's eyes finding hers again, steady, waiting, entirely unaware that the woman he had spent the whole evening trying to know was about to run out of time to be her at all. Margaret pulled Alice into the shadow of a marble column, away from the drifting crowd, her mind moving faster than her heart could keep pace with. "We have to leave now," she said, "before her carriage arrives. If I am gone before she is here, no one will ever have to know there were two of us at all." Alice's eyes were wide and wet, with the particular fear of a servant who understands exactly how much can be lost in one careless minute. "There is a problem, my lady," she said, the wrong title still slipping from her out of 9 years of habit. Lady Cordelia insisted on coming through the front entrance herself. She would not be argued out of it. She said if her name was announced once tonight, it would be announced twice, properly, by her own mouth. Margaret closed her eyes. Of course Cordelia would insist on that. Pride had gotten the family into every disaster it had ever survived, and pride would very likely be what finally finished them. "Then I must be at the front doors before her carriage arrives," Margaret said. "I will meet her, get her turned around, and be back at the estate before anyone else notices there were two Lady Whitmores at Ravensmoor Hall tonight." She turned to go, already composing the excuse she would give Ashcombe, already feeling the shape of the goodbye forming in her chest like a stone she would have to swallow whole. She did not get 3 steps before a voice stopped her. "Leaving so soon." It was not Ashcombe. It was the woman in the fox mask, no longer hesitating at the edge of the room, planted directly in Margaret's path, with her arms folded and her chin lifted in the particular posture of someone who has spent the last hour gathering courage instead of losing it. "Cordelia, darling, you have been avoiding me all evening," the woman said, "which is remarkable, given that we have not spoken properly in 3 months, and you promised me at your sister's wedding that we would catch up the very next time we met." Margaret's mouth went dry. She had no idea who this woman was to Cordelia, no memory of a wedding, no name to attach to the fox mask, now tilted back to reveal a face sharp with suspicion, and something almost like hurt. "Forgive me," Margaret said. "My voice has still not returned. I fear I am not fit for conversation tonight." "Your voice," the woman said slowly, "was perfectly fine 3 minutes ago when you were laughing with the Duke of Ravensmoor loudly enough for half this ballroom to hear you." There was no answer to that. Margaret felt every eye in the small circle of onlookers that had begun to gather turn toward her, felt the particular helplessness of a lie that has run out of road. It was in that exact moment, with no better option left in the world, that the front doors of Ravensmoor Hall opened and a footman's voice rang out across the entrance hall, carrying clean and clear over the music. "Lady Cordelia Whitmore." The ballroom did not stop, not all at once, but the ripple moved through it the way cold water moves through a warm bath, guest by guest, turning toward the entrance, then turning back toward Margaret, then back toward the entrance again, the two facts refusing to sit comfortably beside each other in anyone's mind. Margaret turned. Cordelia stood in the doorway, pale, thinner than she had been that morning, wrapped in a shawl she had clearly refused to remove even indoors, held upright by sheer will and one hand on the doorframe. She had come anyway. Fever and physician's orders and Alice's warnings had not been enough to stop her once she decided her family's name would not be humiliated by absence. She had not, however, accounted for the fact that her own face, unmistakably her own, mask or no mask, was about to appear twice in the same room. The woman in green gasped, one hand flying to her mouth. Around her, murmurs rose like a fire catching dry grass, spreading faster than anyone could stop it. Two Lady Whitmores, at the same ball, at the same hour, one in blue silk and one in a traveling shawl, and no explanation in the world that would make sense of both of them standing in the same room at once. Margaret felt the mask suddenly weigh as much as the whole gown. There was only one way through this that did not end with Cordelia's name destroyed by mourning. She reached up, and before anyone could stop her, before she could talk herself out of the only decent thing left to do, she removed the mask. The feathers came away from her face, and the room, for one long, unbearable second, simply looked. There was no thunderclap, no dramatic scream, only the particular silence of 200 people rearranging an entire evening's worth of assumptions in real time, the housekeeper's face now visible above the lady's gown, and the whispers that followed a beat later were somehow worse than any single loud reaction could have been, because they came from everywhere at once, low and constant, a hive disturbed. Margaret did not look for Cordelia first. She looked for Ashcombe. He stood exactly where she had left him minutes before, near the edge of the dance floor, and his mask was still on, but she could see his eyes above it, wide, fixed entirely on her, and for one terrible heartbeat she was certain she would see disgust there, or worse, pity, the particular contempt a powerful man reserves for anyone who dared to reach above the place assigned to them. She did not see either. She saw something that looked almost like relief. Cordelia crossed the floor first, moving faster than a fevered woman should have been able to move, and reached Margaret's side with a fury that only barely masked the terror underneath it. "What have you done?" she hissed, low enough that only Margaret could hear. "I came here for you, my lady," Margaret said, "and I will leave here for you as well. Whatever this costs, it will cost me, not your name. I will say I stole the gown. I will say I acted alone, that you knew nothing of it. I will take every part of this that can be taken from you and carry it myself." Around them, the murmuring had not stopped. Somewhere near the punch table, a man laughed the particular short, ugly laugh of someone enjoying another family's ruin. Somewhere else, a woman was already whispering the story into a friend's ear, already shaping it into the version that would travel fastest by morning. Margaret felt Cordelia's hand grip her wrist, the same grip from hours earlier in the sick room, though this time it did not feel like desperation. It felt, strangely, like the beginning of an apology neither of them had time to finish. Ashcombe crossed the floor next. He did not hurry, exactly, but he did not wait either, moving through the parting crowd, with the particular authority of a man whose opinion the room had decided mattered more than its own gossip, and he stopped in front of Margaret, close enough that she had to tilt her head back slightly to meet his eyes. The room, sensing a second act, went quieter still. "I owe you an apology, Lady Whitmore," he said to Cordelia first, with a small correct bow, "for the confusion this evening has caused your household." Then he turned to Margaret. "And I owe you nothing," he said, "because you never once lied to me about who you were as a person. You lied about a name. I find I care rather less about the name than I expected to. An hour ago." The room did not know what to do with that sentence. Neither for a moment did Margaret. "You danced with a housekeeper," she said quietly, testing whether the words could be said aloud without the world actually ending. "All evening, in front of everyone." "I danced," he said, "with the only honest person in this entire building. I would happily do it again, in front of considerably more people than this, if she would allow it." Somewhere behind them, the woman in the fox mask made a small strangled noise that might, in a kinder story, have been the sound of gossip losing its appetite. Cordelia, still gripping Margaret's wrist, looked between the housekeeper and the Duke with an expression that shifted, slowly, from panic towards something far more complicated, the dawning understanding that whatever had happened in this ballroom tonight had already moved past anyone's ability to control it, including her own. "Take me home," Cordelia said quietly, to Margaret, not unkindly. "We will discuss the rest of this in the morning, when I have the strength for it." Margaret nodded and reached to help her mistress toward the door, every practical instinct she had spent 9 years cultivating already rising up to manage the disaster, to smooth it, to make it small enough for the family to survive. Ashcomb's hand found hers once more before she could turn fully away. "I will call on the Whitmore estate tomorrow," he said. "Not on Lady Cordelia, on you. I would like, if you are willing, to finally learn your name properly, in daylight, without a mask between us." Margaret looked at him for a long moment, feeling the whole ballroom watching, feeling 9 years of invisibility cracking open around her like ice finally giving way to spring, and found she had no argument left strong enough to refuse him. "Margaret," she said, "Margaret Ashby. It suits you," he said, "better than any borrowed name could have. I will see you tomorrow, Margaret Ashby." She left Ravensmoor Hall with her arm around Cordelia's shoulders, and her own name, finally, spoken out loud in front of everyone who mattered, and did not look back to see how the room settled once she was gone, because for the first time in 9 years, she did not particularly care what the room thought of her at all. The estate was quiet by the time they arrived home, the kind of quiet that comes after a storm has passed, but before anyone has assessed the damage. Cordelia went straight to bed, still pale, still fevered, but with a strange new calm about her that Margaret did not have the energy to question that night. Alice undid the hooks of the borrowed gown in silence, folded the silver mask away in its box, and neither of them said a word about what had happened, because there was nothing small enough to say that would cover it. Margaret did not sleep. She lay in her own narrow bed in her own small room off the kitchen, staring at the ceiling, replaying the ballroom over and over, the fox mask, the whispers, the Duke's steady voice cutting through all of it like something that refused to be embarrassed on her behalf. By morning, the household had 100 questions and no good answers, and Margaret had already decided, somewhere in the sleepless hours before dawn, to give the same one to every single person who asked. "I did what was necessary to protect this family," she told the cook, the stable boy, the housemaids who whispered behind their hands when they thought she could not hear. "And whatever comes of it, I will bear the weight of it myself." Cordelia summoned her just after breakfast, sitting up in bed with more color in her face than she had shown in days, a tray of tea and toast barely touched beside her. "You made a fine mess of things," Cordelia said, though there was no real anger left in it, only exhaustion and something almost like admiration. "I made the mess you sent me to make," Margaret said. "I only failed to keep it contained." Cordelia laughed, a short, surprised sound, the first real laugh Margaret had heard from her in weeks. "That is one way to put it," she said. "Do you know what half the county will be saying about this family by supper tonight?" "I imagine I do, my lady." "And do you know what the other half will be saying about the Duke of Ravensmoor, who apparently spent an entire evening declaring, in front of 200 witnesses, that he preferred a housekeeper to every titled woman in the room?" Margaret said nothing. Her hands, folded in her lap, had gone very still. "He is a fool if he meant it," Cordelia said, "and a worse fool if he did not, because half of Ravensmoor's guests believe he did, and there is no unsaying it now." She studied Margaret for a long moment, something calculating and something tender both moving behind her tired eyes. "What do you want, Margaret? Not what is owed to this family, not what is proper. What do you actually want?" It was the question nobody had asked her in 9 years, and Margaret found she did not have a ready answer for it, because wanting things for herself was a muscle she had let go slack from disuse. "I do not know yet," she admitted. "Well," Cordelia said, settling back against her pillows, "you have all morning to decide, because unless I am very much mistaken, that man is going to be standing at our door before noon, and I do not think either of us has the strength left to turn him away twice in 1 week." Margaret spent the rest of the morning in the small room off the kitchen, doing the accounts, because it was the only thing her hands knew how to do when her mind refused to settle. Columns of numbers marching down the page in familiar orderly rows, debts and incomes and the slow, patient arithmetic of keeping a household alive. It should have calmed her. It did not. At 11:30, a carriage arrived at the front of the house. Margaret heard it from the kitchen window and felt her whole body go still, ledger forgotten, pen still wet in her hand. She heard the front bell, heard the housemaid's footsteps hurrying to answer it, heard a voice she recognized instantly even through 2 closed doors and the length of a hallway. By the time she reached the front hall, wiping ink from her fingers with a rag she had forgotten to set down, Julian Ashcombe was already standing just inside the entrance, without his mask, without the crowd, without any of the ceremony of the night before, wearing a plain coat and an expression that looked, for the first time since she had met him, uncertain. "You came," she said, because it was the only thing her mind could produce. "I said I would," he said. "I generally mean what I say." The housemaid hovered near the stairs, clearly torn between duty and curiosity, and Margaret sent her away with a look that had managed households for 9 years and had not lost its authority overnight. Whatever else had changed. When they were alone in the front hall, Ashcombe took a step closer, close enough that she had to look up slightly to meet his eyes. No mask between them now, nothing borrowed, nothing false. "I have spent all morning being told by half my own household that I made a fool of myself last night," he said. "My aunt has already written me a letter 3 pages long on the subject of dignity and proper alliances. I have not yet finished reading it." "I am sorry for the trouble I have caused you," Margaret said, and meant it, though the words tasted strange in her mouth, an apology for a thing that had not, in her heart, felt like a mistake. "Do not be," he said. "I did not come here for an apology, and I certainly did not come to demand one from you. I came because I told you I would learn your name properly, in daylight, and I intend to keep that promise, whatever my aunt's letter has to say about it." Margaret's throat tightened. "You already know my name," she said. "I know the words," he said. "I do not yet know the woman who owns them. I know a housekeeper who runs an estate well enough that its lady trusted her with the one night that mattered most to its survival. I know a woman who danced like grief that had learned to stand up straight again. I do not yet know what she wants for her own life, once nobody is asking her to save anyone else's." Nobody had ever asked Margaret that question and waited, patiently, silently, for an actual answer, the way he was waiting now, standing in her mistress's front hall with his hat still in his hands, unwilling to fill the silence for her the way so many people had filled it for her before. "I do not know what I want," she said again, more honestly this time than she had said it to Cordelia that morning. "I have spent 9 years wanting things for other people. I am not entirely certain I remember how to want something only for myself." "Then perhaps," he said, "we could find out together, slowly, without masks, and without anyone else's ballroom to hide behind." Margaret looked at him for a long moment, at the plain, honest hope on his face, so different from the careful, unreadable calm he had worn all evening at Ravensmoor Hall, and felt something in her chest that she had folded shut 9 years ago finally give up trying to stay closed. "That would require you calling here rather often," she said. "My duties do not permit me to leave the estate easily." "Then I will call here rather often," he said, and something in his voice suggested this was not a hardship he intended to complain about even once. Cordelia's voice drifted down from upstairs, weak but amused, carrying just far enough to reach the front hall. "Tell the Duke," she called, "that he is welcome for tea, provided he does not expect me to referee whatever this is turning into." Margaret laughed, a real laugh, the kind that comes from the stomach and not the throat, the kind Cordelia's careful performance had never once managed to fake. Ashcombe smiled at the sound of it, and something in his eyes told her he intended to hear it a great many more times. Whatever the county chose to whisper about a duke who had fallen for the woman running someone else's household instead of the woman meant to be running his. In the weeks that followed, the whispers did not entirely die, but they softened, the way scandal always softens once it stops being new. Cordelia recovered fully, kept her housekeeper, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that she did not mind sharing her afternoons with the Duke of Ravensmoor nearly as much as propriety suggested she should. The estate's debts were settled, quietly, through channels nobody troubled to examine too closely, because a duke's interest in a household tends to smooth a great many practical difficulties without anyone needing to say so aloud. And Margaret Ashby, 43 years old, 9 years widowed, 9 years invisible by careful design, found herself, for the first time since her husband died, building a life that belonged entirely to her, one honest afternoon at a time, in daylight, without a single mask left standing between her and the man who had never once looked away.